Good evening, Bill.
Good evening, Sandy.
Okay, we better get a move on because we've already run out of time once, so we're re-recording.
Okay, we're starting over again. Now, see, I want to start over by putting you in the hot seat.
No, absolutely not. Just shoot. This evening, the title, The Ism-ist. What do you think of it, Bill?
I think that it's interesting because you usually don't like putting things into categories, and I do. So this is sort of right up my alley.
Well, it's almost like we'd already spoken about this. Yes, it is. I thought that when I was considering how to approach this question, and I was wondering about the isms and the ists that you are. Can you tell us?
I think we came up with, I say a rationalist, rationalism, atheism, exceptionalism. There's a good one. I like exceptionalism.
Of course you do.
But I don't know. I feel like those are all. Do you think that, I mean, that group of things, if I said that and you didn't know who they were talking about, would you think, oh yeah, they're talking about Bill?
No, because sometimes isms and ists aren't really what we think they are. And I think that is part of the curious nature of them.
I think they're a way of putting other people into pockets or bubbles.
Yes.
I don't think most people would put themselves in those same bubbles.
Well, I don't know, because in the case of something like, for example, a feminist, I think lots of people maybe don't actually care for a true definition.
I think a lot of people define that word completely differently than others.
Yes, and some people consider it to be a kind of equalitarianism.
Yep.
Whereas others think that that is a completely misleading way to view feminism.
Yep.
So if I claim to be a feminist, that is going to mean very different things to many different people. Yep. And actually, to be a feminist, I wonder if it actually changes over time anyway. So the goalposts move with time.
I think that definitely is true with feminism. Yes. I mean, look at how, modern day, very lefty feminists talk about feminists from the 70s as being, milk toast, a bunch of white middle-class women, that kind of thing, so it's like, it's all like different ways of looking at. It's also interesting because you end up changing the definitions of all these things, don't you, in the process of shifting their meaning over time. And so really you're not talking about the same thing anymore.
No, but isn't that it? Is we're not all clued into what the parameters are. But the very fact that there are parameters anyway with all ists and isms is in itself extraordinarily limiting. And where it compartmentalizes, it does disservice to the nuance and subtlety often of what we are. I think.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, I always have my rail against postmodernism, but I think that in some ways, this shifting definitions of everything kind of goes along with deconstructing everything that the way that people have been doing over the past half century or so. Where it's like, you build something on this giant foundation of a definition of what you're talking about, and somebody comes in and says, well, that building's going to fall down because I just changed the definition everything's based upon. It's like, well, it wasn't based upon that. It was based upon this other definition. And, and judging things based upon unfair assumptions that were based. Yeah.
But we are working with unfair assumptions virtually always, are we not?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess to make an argument, you have to make some assumptions. Who decides which are unfair?
Well, this is a very thorny one. It's a very tricky topic to discuss because I think you and I have spoken both privately as friends, but also sometimes on here as well, about the challenges of speaking to something that you don't belong to. And I'm aware that by recording this and putting it on YouTube, there's always a sense that we're open to criticism, of course. But usually we're talking about very kind of benign things. If people don't like it, they don't like it. They're unlikely to say something about it. But this kind of thing really rattles and rankles.
Mm-hmm.
I want us to tread carefully. Maybe because I'm a coward, but also I think it's to do with wanting to be respectful, and maybe sometimes not quite being sure of, even in itself, the language around how to talk about certain aspects of our
Sure, but who
culture.
defines what language is allowed and what language is not? I mean, that in its own right is a tome of conversation,
You and I both know very many people who consider themselves to be extraordinarily woke.
Sure.
And I'm sure you and I, in many ways, can appear to be quite dinosaur-like.
Sure, but I mean that's based on their definitions. Why are their definitions any more valid than yours or mine or somebody else's? That's the.
I wonder about this as well. I mean, that's a really, really good point to make, in that, if we are dinosaurs, you and I, then are we relevant? Maybe relevance is only for
the young.
The young. What do you
At
think
the
about
point
that? Well, maybe
at the
I'm
point
just
at which
maybe I'm being ageist now. Maybe that's my ism.
the at the point at which your music is no longer shown in videos on television, then you're no longer relevant. I don't know.
I'm not sure music videos are any longer a thing, are they?
But you're starting in the 19th century, aren't you?
Yes, I am. So we're going to look first of all at this painting, The Slave Ship by Turner. It has other titles as well, very long-winded. Slave Ship is probably the shortest.
I've got to say that Turner paintings, obviously, his use of color and light, and I mean, this is all like the stuff that he's known for, but they really look far more modern than they are. This stuff to me looks more modern than all of Impressionism, like all of like sort of later Pizarro, all that kind of stuff.
Yes, and I mean, people are painting like this now, of course, aren't they?
Yeah. There's just something, I don't know, it's chaotic and I don't know, there's something really like almost 20th century about some of his paintings to me. I don't know what it is. But yeah. All right. So
this is from
the slave ship.
The Slave Ship.
Yeah.
I think round about 1839, Turner most likely read it was a book or an article that was written by an abolitionist, and it contained information about the ship, the Zong. I don't know if you know about this.
Keep going.
So the Zong was a ship that was being run by slavers inbound to, I think, Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
And they ran short of drinking water. And if people died of natural causes on board, then an insurance couldn't be paid at the end of the journey. Whereas if somebody drowned, for example, or if there was an accident, then
the cargo was lost, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah. So they actually.
So they would kill people.
Yeah, they just threw people overboard.
Sure. Yeah.
So this painting depicts, I mean, you can see down in the kind of foreground these pops of, meant to be kind of the hands, limbs, arms of, dead bodies floating in the water. You've got this classic sort of Turner style, as you've already mentioned, that kind of fieriness, that amazing, I don't know, almost like a viscosity of surface paint, and beautiful luminosity. Now, this painting has got really kind of contradictory interpretations from different critics, again, from different times of that criticism. Turner himself was an abolitionist. And in some ways, some people might consider him to be very progressive in his thinking. Other people think that this is somebody piggybacking or being a passenger on the suffering of others, to, rather than really show suffering, to simply create spectacle. And
How
so
would they ask that he show suffering of slaves other than them, drowning? That seems like a pretty awful suffering to me.
I wonder if it's more that the painting itself is so glorious in some way.
Oh, I see.
And extraordinarily, exquisitely beautiful in terms of its technical capacity for, allowing that light, that it seemed kind of incongruous with that suffering. And
Isn't
that
that in some ways what makes it so powerful, though?
well, maybe. And again, as I said, there are many different interpretations, and there's no reason why you and I don't have our own interpretations of this. Of course, that's the point. But in terms of ism and ist, where Turner considered himself to be a progressive abolitionist, others might query if he was actually being deeply, profoundly insensitive and actually quite racist in his approach to this particular subject matter.
I there's a history podcast called The Rest is History. That's these two British historians. And in this week's episode, they had this guy named Dan Carlin, who's this American historian who I really love, on there. And they were talking about, historical figures and looking at them in modern worlds. And the American guy brought up Thomas Jefferson. And, there's a lot of blowback on Thomas Jefferson because he had a relationship with one of his slaves and had children with her, and Sally Hemings and all this kind of stuff. And he himself owned slaves while writing the Declaration of Independence and all this kind of stuff. And one of the guys says, people can tear him down and use it as an example of, well, he should have been against slavery if he believed in the rights of all man and all this kind of stuff. And somebody else, and then he said, the thing is that if you also look at it as, the words he wrote in the Declaration of Independence were used by tens of millions of people over the next century to leave bondage based upon the words, the descriptions of liberty that he invented in the first place. It's like it's really easy to paint somebody in hindsight, I guess. You know what I mean? Or
also,
put somebody in a bucket.
We have a culture now, a cancel culture, particularly, where
sure,
things that do not please us now simply become erased.
The problem is no one is perfect and above reproach,
Well, I wonder about this also. I wonder about Turner painting in 1840, where in context of 1840, this painting was almost like a kind of zenith of moving away from that racist, hugely bigoted for that time way of thinking about difference.
Sure.
Racial difference, class difference, for example.
I mean, you could argue the fact that he made a painting that cared at all about like the pain of slaves was kind of going out on a limb to make a point. No?
Well, I don't know. I mean, personally, I do find this painting actually, the more I go into it, the more it doesn't sit comfortably with me, because
he was also an old man at the time. He was, 70 years old at the time or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably.
He was born in 1775, so that's
he died. It's about 10 years before he died. So he had another 10 years of life, in which time he did really kind of come out into quite public politics, I suppose. But anyway, this is a fascinating place for us to begin, I think, because we have evidence here of how isms and ists are sort of transmutable through actually a relatively short span of time.
Yeah. I feel like especially in the modern world, there's a there's a scale on any ism where, you know, some people think that the other people have gone too far and the other people say they haven't gone far enough.
But can we just look at equivalencies for a second?
Sure.
Imagine if next year a painting emerges that is intended to be celebrated as an image that captures the suffering of civilians in Ukraine.
Okay.
And I know I'm taking this out of context of racism as such, but in this painting revealed, I don't know, at the Royal Academy or something, we see such exquisite skies and beautiful vistas that are coupled with the suffering, which is kind of relegated really to, like, let's say the bottom of the painting in a formless blob, where the formless blob point of a painting such as this is to actually draw out the subtleties of the sky and to make us wonder about luminosity, about the qualities of light. Really, is that the right theater in which to play this?
Yeah, but you're talking about, we're in 2022. This is 118 or 182 years difference, you know.
Yeah.
It's, you know, somebody, you could take Guernica, right? And you could say, well, okay, would somebody make a war painting like that now? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not, you know.
Much as Picasso was a total shit, the fact is that he was Spanish and he did understand the Spanish people.
Right. Okay. But let's say for the moment that that painting wasn't about Spain. It was about, I don't know, you know, Poland or something like that, right? Like the invasion of Poland. Would somebody could easily say, what the hell does some Spaniard know about the pain of Polish people, you know?
Right. I mean, this is where there's a very interesting line to be crossed between almost like an appropriation and artistic license, creativity.
I think that when you're talking about, I always think that there's an overarching, something that gets missed in conversations about that kind of stuff is that ultimately we do have the commonalities of the fact that we're all humans. You know what I mean? And that is the thing that we have most in common. So
yes, but we have to accept, I think we do accept, that there are some humans who speak from a position of enormous power and elevation because of totally arbitrary reasons, as, you know, the color of one's skin or
sure, but does that make what they say
or,
invalid automatically?
no, I don't think it does, but I think we're being asked more and more to check in with whether we know our privilege when we speak, or when we pronounce upon things that are outside our direct experience, for example.
Sure, but how do you do that?
I don't know. It's very difficult. And the example I want to give is one that's a real world example, which is that in coming close now to completing the novel I've been writing, one of the key characters I write about is a young woman called Amal. And although I do not make it, I don't name it in the story, but to me, she has always been Syrian. And the reason why she is in my book is because she has arrived on an otherwise unnamed island, but for me, very much a Scottish island, as a person with vulnerable person status, as a refugee. Now, do I
know anything about being a refugee in Scotland Island?
Do I understand that? No, I don't. I've not lived through that experience. Can I go there in my imagination, and ought I to be more respectful of those people who've lived it, so that I bring out some quality of the experience? Or do I have to know the experience to give it the honor of writing or expressing about it?
it's a bit of a catch-22, right? Because there are people who would say, how dare you even consider imagining that you know what it's like for that person? But then the same person in the other breath could say, why don't you want for once think about what it feels like to be me? You know, and it's like either one has dynamite inherent in it, you know.
It's as if, you know, there are, again, the sliding scales and sliding doors of all of
Sure.
this in terms of what's allowed, because were I to write as if I was a white male,
Yep.
I'm not sure anyone would really question that.
Although, what do you know about being a white male?
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
Does that mean that I can only ever write about being a white Scottish woman? I mean,
Sure.
if that were the case, that would be not necessarily very dull, but that doesn't give one that artistic breadth that actually most artists, writers, thinkers need.
Require.
Yeah.
Um, I absolutely do not disagree with you on this.
But it's so difficult, Bill, to speak about this.
I think it's, you know, I think there is something, I think there is a thing called, you know, cultural appropriation or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I think that it comes into force when people are talking about using things with malice or diminishing the things that they're using, or like there are situations where it is wrong to use stuff that you haven't experienced. But I think that the line that you have to cross for that to be something that is a negative versus just, I mean, my God, look at food around the entire world.
Right.
You know,
We
tomatoes
see
didn't
that
exist in
appropriation,
Italy, you know.
Yeah, we do see appropriation sometimes as
Sure.
a really wholesome, inclusive,
Yeah.
yet
'Cause it's
diverse thing, because, you know, and has anyone ever complained about eating pasta when they're in
exactly.
Iceland,
And
or, you know,
right.
no. And also, please, anybody listening to this, please bear with me, because I really am feeling my way through this. I absolutely, I'm sure, Bill, you probably feel the same, is that I do not want to cause offense with what I say.
No.
Yet I also want to explore how I actually feel and how I can navigate this subject, which carries enormous weight for any of us now.
Well, I think the now in that sentence is actually the biggest part, is that, you know, this is where society and culture is now, largely because so many things have been pushed into the closet or not discussed or diminished or whatever for so long, that there's sort of a, how, you know, you're never going to put me back in that closet again, which I'm totally agree with and totally understand. But I don't think this isn't the end game. This is still like the fog of war, you know, of trying to figure out all this stuff.
Thinking about, again, very thorny, very difficult thing to talk about in many ways. There was a woman in the States who claimed to be Black.
Yeah.
And
she was a professor of African American studies, that one.
She created a kind of full identity, a whole identity, yep, that was essentially fabricated. Now, the reasons for that are kind of very complex, too complex for us to go into now, but I've really thought about this, and I don't know if I can understand it properly, but I question whether in a culture where we are telling our children that they can choose to be who they want.
Mm-hmm.
For example, this is not diminishing it, it's just trying to feel my way through it. If I tell my child that when they grow up, or through their growing up, they will have a series of choices to make, or things that compel them in a particular direction in their life, maybe to do with their sexuality or their gender. And that as that becomes more culturally available, and the stigma, for example, of any kind of sexual orientation is sort of, I think, at least being gradually broken down, kind of dissolved back into our culture. Certainly I feel that here.
Yeah.
But we're not the same about race.
True.
And it's still jagged in a way that means it's difficult to touch it even.
Yeah. I also heard an entire long podcast conversation about that woman whose name I cannot remember. And the panel included a bunch of African-American and otherwise Black women on the panel.
Mm.
And like they had this entire, like some of them had this entirely different take on it, where if you actually learn enough about that woman's life, it gets more ambiguous as you dig down. And it's like, well, heck, who am I to make any of these decisions? Who is anybody, you know?
Who is anybody? But again, I don't want to just come out with that without applying some kind of thought, reason, or sensitivity to it. So what I mean by that is, you know, if somebody respectfully immerses or chooses or sensitively approaches another race or culture, are they allowed to enter it?
Yeah, I don't know.
Enter into it. You know, I have a very flippant thing here to say, oh, somebody's a Francophile or Italophile, or, you know.
Well, you're Scottish in Southern England. I mean, do you ever feel like an outsider?
Well, yes, but that's maybe not due to my Scottishness. But this is very difficult.
It is landmines abound.
It is, but
I don't think that there should necessarily need to be. And I think that ultimately is part of what's going on now, where it's gotten to the point where you can't even really, it's hard to even have conversations about these things.
Well, look at how terrified I am to say
Sure.
something about this. I'm
Sure.
terrified because I'm aware that I am a white Scottish woman who comes from a place of privilege, and I'm straight, and I'm, you know, there's lots of things in it. The isms are all over me with this one.
Yeah, but are those things that
right? I wonder about my right to opinion or to opine about any of these things.
But isn't it interesting though that like your fear for, you know what I mean, about your opinion, your ability to communicate and even think these things through, is in a lot of ways being defined by other people, which is ultimately was the original problem of a class of people defining thought for so many other people.
I understand this, and this is
it's ironic, you know. Yeah.
So anyway, I do want to just mention that we got Manet on the screen.
Yeah. Why this particular painting?
Well, because Manet, you know, is he a feminist or is he a misogynist? Like, what the hell? This painting, almost as much as Olympia, really calls into question really whether this most pronounced upon 19th century painter, like, what was he all about? Is this painting the evidence of his profound disregard for women?
Yeah, women as accessories,
or
who happen to be nude.
Is it testament to his championing women to be who they want?
Yeah, I think that the problem with that is that, you know, you just played out the two extremes of the line, but it is, a viewer could make a distinction anywhere along that line, right? You know, two people could very much disagree. I mean, do we know how Manet felt himself? I mean, you've probably read up on this more than I have.
No, actually, Manet considered himself to be most kind of egalitarian and progressive.
And again, this was 160 years ago.
So maybe at this time, the clues, if we're being art detectives, which you and I often are, we could say, the obvious elements, like the woman looks out the painting at us. I mean, yeah. Olympia does the same. She brazenly stares back at us. It's a defiance. So personally, for me, I've always thought of this painting as shrugging off the mores of the past and moving into this new paradigm where women were not concealed, and that actually the clothing on the men and for the time, their modernity in what they're wearing, for example, speaks about a moving into balance. I mean, other people I know, other women I know find this painting deeply offensive.
So you could flip that though and say this painting is about those women and the men are accessories.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation of it, knowing nothing other than the painting. It's I think a lot of times people see what they want to see.
Well, always.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's you can't, I don't think you can always, no, let me change that. You can almost never trust someone's opinion because it's so, no one's opinion is necessarily worth that much more than anyone else, unless it's an opinion of fact, right? Like, a question where somebody knows more about a topic than somebody else, how to print color photographs. I've never done that before. I'm going to trust you in the order that we need to do the baths because you know how to do that. I trust your opinion on that. But whether or not you or I believe that he's denigrating that woman or elevating the woman in this painting, my God, like that, I think she looks beautiful. Is she there purely as like a sex object? I don't think so.
Again, we could talk, we don't have time, but we could talk about, like the male gaze and, is the male gaze directed actually at her? Is the male gaze coming from Manet himself?
And this is 1863, which means that, it was like they were bringing in neoclassical elements to all of this stuff. I mean, there's like so much going into.
Yes, there's a lot of classic references.
So really, maybe it has nothing to do with gazing. And he's just like, well, this is what, how we draw women in when we're looking back at sculpture or whatever. So it's.
But here's the point again, and a lot of the sixth form at the moment are very interested in this. Can a male painter depict a female nude without being enthralled and caught in the male gaze?
Sure. Yes, I think so. I mean, as somebody who has photographed a number of men and women nude, I don't know. I think I do a pretty good job capturing female nudes, and I don't think that I am. It's interesting. You could also argue, though, that like somebody entrapped in the artist's male gaze in this case is actually an advantage because,
But I have to stop us talking about Manet because what I realize is that, we're also, fascinatingly enough, spending a great deal of time talking about paintings by white men.
Well, it is the 1860s and 40s after all.
Yes, I know, but
okay, so here we are 5 years ago.
Yes, Kara Walker.
And this is a big giant drawing or painting. What's do you know what the medium is on this stuff? What is this, like a watercolor? What'd she use?
I think so. I mean, it's classed as drawing.
See, I just made an distinction there. Does Kara Walker go by she? I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yep. So I think she was born in Minneapolis,
Okay.
1957, maybe. Can't remember. But she's an American artist. She has worked in a wide variety of media. I would urge everybody to go and look at Kara Walker's work, her silhouettes, paper cuts, installations. They are riveting. Now, we're here because of isms and ists. There's also, again, for people watching, because we're going to run out of time, so unfortunately, on this, please do go and look at Roxanne Gay, Watching as This Is Unrolled. It was a collaboration between MoMA and the BBC, and she speaks to the drawing as a kind of declaration, basically, of Black history.
You should put that in the show notes,
yeah,
or in the thing when you put it.
So
yeah, it is interesting in here. There are, racist tropes, arguably on both sides, but mostly Black racist tropes in here from all eras, right?
The thing that I find really fascinating about it, again, I'm now taking from what Roxanne Gay says, is that, we might feel as if we want to look away, but we mustn't. We must keep looking, and we must revisit our looking at this drawing and at these images. These images are vital because they tell us or remind us about the not just trials and tribulations, but the experiences, the sufferings, the traumas of our fellow humans. Now, it's a Black experience, perhaps, of a Black experience. Am I allowed to enter that?
Enter it? How do you mean enter it?
Enter into the space of even pretending to understand. We're going to run out of time, Bill.
Okay. If you understanding it isn't the point, then why did she make it? Isn't that why she's doing it? So,
yeah, I think so.
I think that sort of gives you implicit rights to be able to do that.
Well, we could talk for longer. Perhaps we should.
Yeah, we should come back to this next time.
And just before we go, I'll have time just to say goodbye, Bill. Bye, Bill.
Well, you have, 1 minute and 11 seconds.
So it's 11 feet by 16 feet.
Yeah.
It occupies a big space physically. But
do you know if it's still up? I haven't seen this before.
I don't think it is. No, we could find out where it is in the world.
Okay.
But the big space it occupies, obviously, is then filled up with cartoons that are actually relatively quite small.
Right.
And also look at the intensity of the tone as it moves in and out of our, I guess, consciousness.
Yeah.
Goodbye, my friend.
We'll talk to you later, Sandi.
Bye.
Bye.